Hello, good evening and a warm welcome to all of you here at Neuer Berliner Kunstverein, as well as in front of your screens at home. We are very happy to have you with us tonight. Those who know us and who have attended events at NBK in the past might feel that this is a rather unusual setting, yet we are very grateful that we are able to bring our program to you this way, despite the current regulations. Before we start tonight's talk, I would like to briefly introduce our guests to you. They are already seated or on air with us. Griselda Pollock is here, live from Leeds, and next to her are sitting Susanne Leeb and Monika Baer. I start with Monika Baer, the initiator of tonight's gathering. As you all probably know, Monika has this year been awarded with the Hannah Höch Prize by the State of Berlin for her outstanding artistic achievements. And on this occasion, she currently presents her most recent works here at NBK, all of which were created last year in Los Angeles, where she was a Regents lecturer at the University of California. Previously, she was a professor at Bard College in New York, and now she's back in Germany to teach at the Städelschule in Frankfurt. Monika studied painting in the 1980s at the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf, where she was confronted with the history of painting that was predominantly male and white, and at a time when art criticism strongly questioned the autonomy of painting and its potential for innovation. Both aspects subsequently had a strong influence on the way Monika approaches her work, since she consciously decided to keep working with the conflicted medium of painting. Upon Monika's initiative, NBK recently published the first German-language edition of the essay Modernity and the Spaces of Femininity, which was written in 1988 by Griselda Pollock, and which offers a brilliant analysis of class and gender relations since the end of the 19th century, whose effects can be felt to this day. Griselda is professor of social and critical histories of art, as well as the director of the Central for Cultural Analysis, Theory and History at the University of Leeds. She has also worked at the universities of Reading and Manchester, and this year she has been the first art historian to be awarded the Holberg Prize, which acknowledged the importance of her work on feminism and arts histories. Griselda Pollock has been constantly developing an international, queer and post-colonial feminist analysis of art's diverse histories, and she has just completed 43 years of dedicated teaching and research, and it's certainly an honor to have her with us tonight. And last but not least, we're happy to welcome Susanne Leeb on our panel, who is the Berlin-based art historian and professor for contemporary art at the Leuphana University in Lüneburg. She is also a co-editor of the book series Polypen at B-Books, Berlin, and a member of the advisory board of the German art magazine Texte zur Kunst. Here at Texte zur Kunst, she participated in the edition of issues on the topics, for example, history, languages of art, they are us, and property. Susanne Leeb has repeatedly discussed current events in the art world with Monika Baer in various panel discussions, and wrote in detail about Monika's work in her essay Liquid Gazes, which has been published in 2014 as part of the reader Aesthetics of the Flesh. So I'll stop here. Monika, Susanne, Griselda, please feel free to add whatever I was short of mentioning. And just the last short note to those of you who are watching us via live stream. Please feel free to join us by posting your questions for the speakers on one of our social media channels, that is Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. We'll happily include these in the discussion later. And now I'll gladly pass the word to you, and I'm wishing you and all of us an interesting and insightful evening.
Yeah. Some real applause for in the beginning. So thank you, and thank you everybody for coming and maybe watching. So we thought that we would structure this conversation in a way that Monika and Griselda will talk or respond to certain topics from their respective perspectives. So it's not about Griselda commenting on paintings she cannot really see, but really rather talking about topics which Monika and Griselda could share or have in common, starting from the translation of the book. And actually, I mean, it's an essay in vision and difference. So what is already remarkable that this essay, or that it's a book now on its own, the modernity and spaces of femininity, is now a book on its own, and that Monika has chosen this very specific essay, and not to have a translation of the whole book, which would probably more also the task of art historians to complete German library. And I was kind of shocked to notice that this essay, or actually like the whole book, is not translated to German. So there is some work to do. So this already is the first question we can start with, because this is kind of sticking out, that this is just not just, but this essay you chose for translation. So obviously there is something going on in this essay which is very interesting, or was very interesting for you, and maybe you can comment what it is.
Yes, I'm glad you do so. Mm-hmm. So the idea struck me when I was fantasizing about potentially having, teaching in Germany, in a German-speaking school, which the Städel School, for instance, is not. Teaching is in English. And then I was wondering, in the province, what I would be possibly reading, and I thought of this text straight away. I have read that before, but in English with a class. And then it occurred to me it wouldn't be accessible to them at all. And in fact, these art histories aren't accessible to anybody that's not speaking English. And therefore, I thought, well, it has to be translated. And maybe to answer the question, why this text, I must say I have a certain, stable fascination for this text, and I derive a lot of pleasure from it right from the first time I read it, which was, as I must admit, a little late, but it doesn't matter, because of its cinematic, for my eyes, cinematic qualities, for instance. So I remember not only reading the text, but actually looking at it in the book, in Vision and Difference, and somehow, the succession of pages, I mean, this is nothing new, but the succession of pages, the way paintings were described as the informants of the dynamics within this, as it's written in your text, this phantasma of the masculine city, right? And the placement of these, at that point, black and white images in that book, somehow they had an appeal of a kind of architectural model, or a kind of 3D effect for me. And I was also interested in the kind of, because of this idea of a model, and you describe in your book, the common thread of your writings as being concepts, right? So I think that was also very attractive to me, this merging of a 3D model and a concept, which also has its simplifications to open up possibilities. In this case, men are men, women are women, everybody's straight, and so on. So it's sort of broken down to certain parameter, as one says. This is also something I found really interesting. And then in the text, you really gave me the possibility to get out of this sorrow about seeing or perceiving female painters as on the margins of something much more interesting, actually, going on in the center. Because you open up, in your analysis, you open up the city as a fiction or as a field, you open it up as a very charged field that is structured by, axes of hierarchies of power, but also of desire. And you manage, through this analysis, to place these painters, these female painters, into the center, respective center, each and every time, So it's not Manet and it's not Degas, it's Mary Cassatt and it's Berthe Morisot. They are the centers just as much. So the centers are always where these very informed and precise articulations are happening. So that's the reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know, Griselda, do you want to comment on that? Because I remember that in the rather in the end of the book, you write that this essay is structured around two topics, which is the gaze and the space. So the question of space is certainly super crucial, and Monika describing this architectural model and how the city is organizing the accessibility of desires. I don't know, do you want to comment on Monika's description?
Well, I would love to, but first of all, I'd like to say three things. I cannot say how grateful I am to Monika for using her prize to enable this text to find its life in German. I spent 9 or 10 months in Germany as an au pair when I was about 18 to be able to speak German. So this was a great thing because I now read myself in this beautifully written German. I want to thank my translator, Brenda Holweg, who struggled with the sort of strangeness of my early feminism and my Marxism and my psychoanalysis to render it, I hope, to be a text that is beautiful to the German ear as you read it. Translation is such a complicated process because I understood even more from the working on this translation how radically differently German turns everything around. The actual, the beginning of the sentence now ends up at the end in order to get the balance and the rhythm. So I want to pick up on that in the sense of the sheer musicality or structures and modalities and spaces of language. So translation and transformation and crossing these borders is an extraordinary gift. And I have to also thank Michaela Richter for the incredible care with which she produced this book. So now I have in my hand not an article in a collection of essays from 1988 when no publisher would recognize me as an art historian, and so I was always publishing in black and white. I've only ever had color in a book. In 2018, it's the first time I've ever had color illustration in a book that I wrote, which is part of the politics of where feminism comes in publication. So the fact that it's a beautiful book and has given the color also back to the artists and has felt and sourced the images and also reconstructed this passage, not the Passagen sort of arcades, but the journey that Monika was describing. I think also I'd like to say I love the idea of having an artist read a book and see it in the way that an artist sees it, rather than an academic saying, do I agree with the ideas or the arguments? But you have so beautifully suggested precisely this way of seeing the Baudelaire text, which is a journey, not just a description of the places he could go, but literally is almost like a kind of Rossellini or it's a film. It is a film. He moves from, the park to the loges of the theatre, to the entertainments, and then to the depths of the dark streets of Paris, of the lowest of the low brothels. And it was that sense of who had the freedom to move, which was plotted out by the paintings. And I wanted to establish that, but exactly what Monika's saying, we were fighting from the very beginning to recognize that what is significant about the Impressionist group to which these artists belong is not that they were messing around with paint in a certain way. They were struggling to make sense of modernity as they experienced it. And this is the first fully egalitarian art movement. So if you open the catalogue to the first 1874 exhibition and you look at the list of artists, you will find blah, blah, blah. And then you get Monet and Morisot. They were never on the edges. They were never pupils. They were co-creators side by side with these other artists, and they were in dialogue with them. And precisely because of the fact that they're in a dialogue with Degas and Monet and Renoir and Pissarro and all the politics, and these women are absolutely at the center of it. They're organizers, they're exhibiting, they believe in this concept of independence in art and prepared to risk their reputations to be associated with this band. That dialogue means you have to understand modernity as dialogical and dialectical in relation to the experience of masculinity and femininity, and class as a factor in what those are, and therefore the invisible women of my book are also the invisible working class women who appear in certain of the journeys of Baudelaire and the artists. So I feel that you really have grasped this idea that it's both cinematic and profoundly to do with how you inhabit the spaces of the city, which of course is so central to women's experience to this day. Most of any woman, you know, and any minority knows the streets are not theirs. You navigate cities, you navigate spaces in the knowledge that there is someone who's at home in it and you're not. And yet the places you are maybe at home are considered of insignificance, called the domestic. So I wanted in the book very much to make sure that you saw that the men were as much involved in painting dining rooms and sitting rooms and the gardens where their children play. This isn't a world of men and women. It's a world of sociability and intimacy and proximity and distance. And these are all parts of their attempt to make sense of modernity as they experienced it. So I really thank you for this reading that made me go back to think that's what I was, as it were, almost in a sense, as a painter, I was already imagining this in a painterly way, even as I wrote it in an academic way.
That's a very interesting thing to say. Is my microphone on? That's a very interesting thing you just said. When you were writing the text, you were in a way in contact with a kind of phantasm of a painterly approach?
I would say that what made it possible for me to become the art historian that I have become was that I was alienated from art history, but I was working largely with contemporary women artists. And increasingly, I realize that some of the things that I write make sense to people who are painters because of a certain way of putting things together that isn't linear. It isn't a purely, you know, philosophical argument. It's always got that space of, please imagine this, please situate yourself in this. And I always think that the kinds of arguments that I build are rather in the way that something like a painting comes into being slowly in certain ways. I became a painter long after I became an art historian. I only took up painting in the beginning of this century, but I now realize that, and I'm very bad at it, but I've always understood that sense of thinking, what happens when you analyze painting and think as a painter? Can you write as a painter?
That's really interesting. By the way, it was not Monet and Morisot, it was Cassatt and Morisot you were talking about. You said Monet, so it's Cassatt, Mary Cassatt and Morisot, right?
No, I was saying in the 1874 catalogue of the First Impressionist exhibition, we see them literally one after the other. It's not Monet, and then somewhere later we add Morisot in.
Okay.
Cassatt only joined the group when Degas invited her. She exhibited, I think, first with them in 1877.
Excuse me.
No. Maybe I would suggest that we go to number 2. Monika, can we see one image? To number 2, to Mary Cassatt, so that you see actually whom we are talking about. And Griselda, maybe you can talk because we're talking about spaces of femininity and domestic spaces. With whom you share your space, like in the background of your, like who do we see with you on the screen?
Behind me is a beautiful photograph of Mary Cassatt in the 1890s, so she's already a mature middle-aged woman, and she's, if I move out of the way, she's reading the newspaper. So this is for me an image of the intellectual woman, the reminder that the mind is as active as the person. But the painting we're looking at, which is called 5 O'Clock Tea, so it's the incorporation into French bourgeois and American bourgeois culture of the idea of the afternoon tea from the British. What I like about this painting, what I was interested in Mary Cassatt, was the way in which she compresses space so that you are very much in the space with these very substantial figures. You're not remote and looking at them. You are as it were, in the space, which is now a space of sociality because it's a formal afternoon. Somebody's come to visit. You get all the beautiful painting of the showy silver that for the tea set. You get the indication of the gold painting, the gold framed painting behind of something slightly possibly Japanese. But then you are really focusing on two women. And once you have pictures of two women, you don't have a voyeuristic gaze on one. They become a conversation, and there's implied third, seen just over the top of the cup. But what I like very much is the figure on the left, who is clearly slightly removed from the conversation. She's withdrawn, she's thoughtful. The gesture of her hand is reflective. There's some kind of interiority to someone as she sits there, while the other one is this beautifully clever analysis of the gloved hands, the raised finger as she, all the gestures of polite culture, but her face is completely obscured by the cup. So there's a kind of humor to it, but that's what I would start off with.
Yeah, no, thank you, because I think this is a painting when we can talk, I mean, it almost, every aspect we would like to talk about is condensed in this painting. And one aspect is not maybe the gaze, we could talk about this later, but the question of a certain specificity, I knew I would stumble upon it, specificity, because this is something you mention with quoting Hélène Cixous in the when you knew forward, this kind of, that there is no woman who is a representative type of the woman, but everything is about specificity. Yes, I made it. And so we were wondering, because what in the relation to the question of the political, because we always think when entering the political space we have to become non-specific, or we have to share a common goal and certainly lose a certain way of specificity. And I think it's very interesting to think these two moments together, that you can be very, very specific, and only when one is very specific you can contribute to a different goal as well. And maybe we could talk about this also in relation to the way Monika, you are painting your paintings, because I mean, when we are looking at the trunks, it's a kind of a strange room. We are confronted with like a trunk, and actually the constellation of elements in the picture plane are not that different. We have certain very little configuration of elements, in your case a wall, a trunk, a background, also a very squeezed space. And maybe you can also go back to to the paintings, one of your trunks, Monika, maybe it's a switch, and you could talk a little bit about the meaning of the specificity in terms of painting, and then maybe Griselda, you can talk a little bit about the question of specificity in terms of feminist movement and how necessary the question of specificity is for you in the question in respect to the question of feminism.
Difficult connection, but I can sort of have a go at it. I can try. Well, specificity, I would say, in my case, most of my motifs, they tend to be rather common, in the sense of common, nothing special, but common, also shared. And then once that is sort of settled, once that settles into a configuration, like the teardrop, the ruinous tree trunk, the wall, and so on, or whatever other motifs I've painted before, once that's done, I spend a lot of time developing or finding out the specifics of what I'm painting. So in this case, I would say, yes, the wall, okay, I have to solve that problem somehow. But the part that really is challenging me and demanding my attention is the surface of those trunks, let's call them that, and how they exactly are, each of them differently. So they're not generalized in my eyes. I don't see myself generalizing, a depiction. I don't see myself painting a generalized image of a tree, and it isn't even about trees. It isn't. I'm not interested in trees. I'm interested in this weird layers of bark and shedding and exposure to the background or to these diagonal, let's call them rays of light coming down. This ruinous surface holds a very specific information. That's why it's so detailed. And I worked so long on these paintings, I suppose for that reason, to find that out, that I could even see them as kind of codes. It's like a key or a code. It's not that I could understand it, but that's how it's supposed to be. And then the next painting comes on. So that's what I can say about being specific in these paintings. And I think one of the reasons I have to be specific is because I'm not interested in the depiction of a tree or the illustration of the idea of a tree, but I'm interested in an embodiment taking place. So.
But one more question back to this, because it's a certain number of paintings. Why do you? At which point do you stop? Not series. I wouldn't call it a series. Like in a way, it's a series, but on the other hand, it's not a series. Why do you decide? Have you tried out enough possibilities so there is no fifth or no sixth possibility?
Well, I've tried it a few times because it takes so long for me to get into that state. So I have to get into that state, and I sort of go off and I'm in that state for months. By the time I'm in there and I'm painting those paintings, I'm reluctant to come out again because it was such an effort and a world in itself. So I try and sort of squeeze out another fifth or sixth painting, and it never really works because I'm not interested anymore. It's done. It's about this certain sequence, and it's about the process that can take place through the setting and the framing of this circumstance. The place that's painted here. That space. It repeats itself. There's something that happens between myself and the painting, A, and B within the paintings. And it's not much, but there it is. And once that's done, it's done. I'm not going to start painting something, change it, and do a variation. I mean, I haven't ever really managed to do that properly. Not in big paintings. It's just done then, alas.
Okay. Yeah. So, Griselda, what would be your take on this notion of specificity?
I love what you've just said, Monika, because it made me think of two things. A conversation between Cassatt and Degas, and one of the things that I've written about to enable people to be able to see Cassatt, one of the things that Degas said is it takes you a long time to see a subject, and you should stick with it. So in the art history, nobody ever says, God forsake us, Degas kept painting ballet dancers. Why ballet dancers? But because whatever the subject is, it takes an incredible time to see it, and there's something endlessly fascinating as these paintings go. And that's the same, I think, with Mary Cassatt, that for her, the area in which she was working was the picture that I don't know, can you see number 3 on my version, the two young women?
The lodge?
Yeah, the lodge. So the theatre is an incredibly interesting and complicated space. So as a subject, rather like your trees, the theatre, which obviously has a social meaning because it's one of the places in public that women went. About 1 million people went to the theatre in Paris every month or something. I mean, some phenomenal number. Okay, this is the great era of Sarah Bernhardt and the great era of a sort of whole series of French dramatists. They introduced the matinee for intellectual women to be able to go to the theatre. So the painting that's on the cover of the book is an afternoon, a matinee, which is why the woman is intent and she's probably watching Sarah Bernhardt in some important play. So this is about culture and intellectual and engagement and things. But of course, it's a very tricky place in public because you are going to be looking and being looked at. So there's a whole series of paintings that Mary Cassatt does of what it means to be embodied in a public space which is theatrical. So she's not showing you the stage, she's showing you people, sometimes on show, people watching, and it takes a long time for her to work out what's interesting in a painterly way and a pictorial way, and spatially and also therefore thematically, in this space. Just as it took, for instance, Manet a very long time to work out about the café. And if you track Manet's paintings up to the bar at the Folies Bergère, which probably wasn't going to be his last painting, but he died so young it became it, he has about 6 or 7 takes. Do I need them at the bar? Do I need to be looking at them? Do I need the waitress? Do I not need the waitress? Because they're trying to work out what it is, and they don't know what it is they're trying to paint. Okay, but they only are going to do it between this sense of what actually concerns you. So what concerns Cassatt is structure and sets of relations. So she has to have people, she has to have space, but she doesn't want figures in a landscape, so she has to compress the space and then make us feel something of that material compression. Now that's very different from the way Morisot paints space, because her spaces are a sense of someone, a woman being remote from something that is in the distance, that she can't occupy the same space as the world. So that's what I think about this question of specificity. It's not specificity as women or even as an individual woman. And, you know, Morisot is a high-class Catholic French woman from a very bourgeois world. Mary Cassatt comes from new American money, railway engineers and sugar magnates, and she's a Protestant. You know, this makes very different elements in the world they live in. She's exiled from America. She's not part of French society in the same way. And so there's lots of specificities between them, of course, that divide them. But we want to look at what is it that they see in this situation of the modern that they're trying to get hold of that requires them to stay with it. So the second thing Mary Cassatt stays with is becoming. And becoming involves, in this particular painting, you can see these young women who are just being brought into public life. They're becoming women. It's the subject of Simone de Beauvoir's fantastic essay in her Second Sex about the girl. What is it to pass from the child to the woman? But the other thing Mary Cassatt is fascinated is children. And the whole late 19th century suddenly realizes these are not just little people. This is another substance, and the bodies of children, I mean, I paint children as well, they're completely different proportions. And what is the subjectivity of a child? And it's not because she's wanted to be a mother or because she's a woman, she's maternal. She can only do it because she's not. She's just observing this becoming, this difference between the adult and the child. And just as you're, whatever the different things, Monika, you say, become the thing through which you're going to explore through painting and which will make you make paintings that themselves are always questioning that, I think we can see the same thing in that. So it's the specificity of reading what a painter, as per painter, has done, which gives rise to what I then think makes Cassatt a crucial painter to have in our imaginations as we think about that, as indeed Morisot, not because they're women versus men, but because they find their problem, the problematic, the question that they need to keep painting to answer.
Can I ask you something? Because nevertheless, one of the key topics, or one of the main topics in this text that's just been translated is how the paintings by Morisot and Cassatt, for instance, how they bear witness to the limitations of the space these women are in and to the boundaries that separate them from an access to, you know, the larger world in which their contemporaries and colleagues are moving about. And that's one point. And the other point concerning children and these young women now in this painting that's up right now, they look like 2 sardines squashed in a can. My question is, yeah, children and young women, but, you know, they are now entering the public sphere, society. That's a kind of debut situation probably. And now the expectations towards them as what a woman is and what a woman is supposed to be and how a woman is supposed to be is crashing in on them, and they don't look that happy about it either. So I read them through your text, as highly politically articulate paintings on the forces working upon these people as women.
Yeah, I pick up two sides to you. I quite agree. What I like about this picture is the anxiety, that terrible artificial stiffness. You don't know, you can't relax in this because you don't know what to do with your body, right? Because, and I think it is quite frequent, the suddenly, for young women, the discovering of the erotic masculine intrusive gaze, the sense of appraisal is a terrible shock as you move from the child to adult, etc. And these are on show and everything about them, and they don't know they can't relax into that. So that's right. And their faces have, she borrows in a sense from Piero di Francesco's sort of way of painting they haven't yet configured into a fully formed face. There's a sort of the eyes, the tension. And then of course it's all a reflection. It's a beautiful pre-Manet reflection because you can see them reflected in the mirror behind them. So that's true. But I would like to just shift what you said, Monika, a little bit. I am getting away from the notion that the large world is the world that men and women live in confined worlds. So the whole mapping that I was doing in this article is that there are worlds, there are some worlds that these bourgeois men and women share, and the line which divides the Cassattes and the Morissots from the Degas and the Manets is not public and private, the larger world versus the interior world. It's the axis of bourgeois men and their sexual use and commerce with working class women. There's a different axis. It's not public-private, or as it were, private and public. The women can go into public. They are in different sorts of ways. Their world is as large, intellectually, culturally, spatially, as men. But what they cannot do is hunt in the city sexually.
Wait a minute. Yeah, that for sure. Well, it isn't that common at the moment either. But anyway, that for sure. But what about, I just read in a letter, a correspondence of Berthe Morisot. She's in the salon, her mum's sitting somewhere sitting somewhere, and she's sort of friends that she's supposed to be walking around with aren't there. And there's this sudden fretting that she will be actually alone, seen alone in the salon, and then, what will people think of her? So what about that?
Oh, surely, that's precisely the point. And Mary Bashkirtsev, the Russian, writes about this constantly. Precisely because the public sphere is also the sphere of the predatory masculine. The only way a middle-class woman can survive in that is she has to be accompanied. So there's a beautiful painting by Gustav Kayabot of a bourgeois man with his top hat walking across the pont, one of the bridges near the Gare Saint-Lazare, and there's a woman walking probably 3 steps behind him, she's very well dressed, and all the art historians we're trying to puzzle out. Is this a couple and she's just slipped back? Or is this a man just slowing down to look back at a single woman? Because if she's a single woman, then that indicates a different kind of status. Not only she can be dressed beautifully, expensively, but then she's probably not une femme, honnête. She's not the honest woman, she's not the respectable woman, she's not the ideal of woman. So the Marika Bashkirtsev writes in her diary that she wants to go to the Louvre because she needs to see some paintings because she's for her painting, but she has to wait for her sister or her aunt or somebody to get dressed to go with her because she cannot go unchaperoned.
Right.
And so there are limitations, but the limitations are because of this infusion of the public space with bourgeois men's, what I'm going to call the predatory sexuality. And that's what you see in Baudelaire's text. The journey, he's always observing the beautiful little girls in the car park and the nice women, and the women at the theatre, this is all fine, etc. But then, once you go to the Café Concert, and below that, then the commerce is between bourgeois men and working class women, and the middle class women are not there, or else they're accompanied, and the ones who are not accompanied or just accompanied by one man are probably courtesans.
Okay, so, but just to note, talking about predatory men, this is, I don't want to essentialize this, I want to refer this back to the mapping, namely that, as you write, when the bourgeois class, was built, there was this separate. Women were taken out of the commercial realm they were in before, right? They were in a certain in the middle class, like lower than that. Of course, women were working, yeah, but they were invisible at home, not in shops, not taking care of the finances of the family business and so on, and. So they were at home, and then they had to be respectable, and there was this monetary division between the monetary division showing non-commerce, domestic love, children, generosity, care, blah, 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 big bad world of men and everybody else. And thus, because of this, on the commerce side, there were available bodies for men, available women for men, everybody poorer in principle, in theory, may be available, right down to sort of professionals. But the women were separated from each other through this divide too, so they were kept apart, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to essentialize. What I call the predatory male thing is precisely articulated by Baudelaire. It's insofar as that is what he is describing, a certain kind of gaze. It's not all men, but per men, because obviously there are queer men not participating this in certain way, and there are working class men who are not available to wander around. They don't have the money to do this in a certain kind of way. So we have to keep this class and sexuality in a sense. But it is the infusion of the public sphere with that potential, which is what causes an incredible panic in the 19th century, that is focused on this fantasy that almost all women, unless they are kept in sort, are prostitutes. There's a wonderful French historian called Alain Corbin about this. It's like a moral panic, similar to we have periodic moral panics where somebody else is the cause of the corruption of society. And in the 19th century, it was concerned with the question of commercial sex, but insofar as that happens, you're right, it has the double effect, right? It's always affecting one woman in one way and the other woman the other way. And the point is, who is writing that script? Yeah. And in what extent do Morisot and Cassatt in this egalitarian art movement help us to see that there are other scripts, right? Other sets of relations, other ways in which sociality and intimacy and, as it were, the domestic space operated, that it had meaning that isn't simply shaped by that particular narrative, which is Baudelaire, and it's taken up by Benjamin. Walter Benjamin makes the point that the only gaze in the city is the erotic one. Well, that's the question. Is that the only one? No, but it is this one that has to be negotiated by women, both working class women and respectable women, I mean middle class women.
But that brings us maybe to a delicate other point, the question of erotic gaze by women. And especially, I mean, has to do with, first of all, like we can stay with this image, in how far is it possible to paint the body of a woman without exhibiting this body only as an erotic, I'm saying only, which is negative, let's say as an erotic object. I mean, this whole question of women only being the object of the male gaze has been the point of departure of feminist art history. So this is one part, like this painting does not offer a lot to this point, but we also have selected, Monika, maybe you can go to Berthe Morisot, Women at Her Toilet.
Number 7.
Number 7, for example, where, maybe Monika, you can also like maybe describe your approach to this painting. And it's a general question which also certainly attributes to the way you are painting and to your artworks in general. And there is always a kind of a play, I would say, with the seduction of the observer. You have these really like juicy backgrounds, these great colors. You really would like to already, maybe not you, I'm not generalizing, but I would love to like lick at them. And then you have these kind of like rejections, things which are too concrete, things which reject you, so things which attract and reject at the very same time in your paintings. There's always a deception. You want to see more, but then there is something on the surface which blocks the gaze, which is disappointing, or you just mirror yourself in a detail. So there is a kind of a play going on, I think, with attraction and deception of that attraction. But yeah, depends where you would like to start with. I mean, we can start with the question of the. Like in your book, you write about that Morisot has a voyeuristic potential. And yeah, maybe we can circle a little bit around the question of the gaze as an erotic gaze, and who is the topic, and who's the subject, and who's the object, and who has the right to look, and who has the right to look back, and how can you maybe also maintain or allow yourself to be an object to look at without being subjected to a hierarchical, exploitative position.
Well, I saw this painting in the Art Institute of Chicago the same time I saw this Gentileschi painting that I wrote about and talked about on the phone. We talked about it on the phone. And I found it really stunning to see this painting by Morisot, which for my eyes is so erotic, and seems also to use the kind of elements that that would be staged for this kind of erotically perceptive gaze. And therefore, I mean, not therefore, but I personally don't believe in, having a male connotation for the objectifying gaze, I mean, even if it's been exercised, in documents, painting as documents, or we know of it more, in that context, I just don't believe in adhering, masculinity to an objectifying gaze, as I don't believe in adhering sensitivity to the woman, So I am totally for dislodging these attributes from sexes and genders. So I'm really actually against that. So therefore, I find it interesting that, for instance, there is sometimes, I fear there's a tendency to kind of borrow from the history of definitions of womanhood: virtuous, non-aggressive, non-predatory, not greedy at all, and so on, demure, tender, caring, and so on, to even now use them while interpreting paintings. And then, for instance, the painting that is depicted in your book is this Morisot painting, right? Yep. And just when I was reading, we were preparing for this conversation, I then only thought, oh, wow, is this the same woman?
It's number 6, yeah.
You have
number 6 on the...
Oh, you can't see it, number 6, yeah. I thought, oh, wow, this is the same woman, because this was described in the book as, a glimpse of a woman. You'll say something about this in a minute, I hope. And then I was comparing it to, to this painting, where it's the same outfit for my eyes, same person, the same dress, the same shoulder, bared. So I'm interested in this complexity of the person that's painting and the complexity of the painting itself. That's something I really believe in if a certain quality is given, And I really have big faith in really complex things happening within a painting and within a person, be it male or female.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right to, as it were, blow up, explode this simplistic thing. So I have to say two things. There is no such thing as the male gaze. Laura Mulvey used that phrase once in 1974, and it has been the burden ever since. So, first of all, what she was arguing, what feminist theory argues, is that certain apparatuses, particularly the cinematic, masculinize the viewing position because the two main operations of cinema are fetishistic scopophilia. You make it so beautiful that it is fetishizing away the anxiety the woman represents to the masculine psyche, the heterosexual masculine psyche, or the other one is that you deal with your anxiety by sadistic voyeurism. And these are very specific things that Freud articulates as responses to the anxiety of castration. Now, you have to buy into that in order to buy that, okay? At the same time, so anybody who occupies a certain cinematic position, that is not because I'm a man or a woman, my gaze is masculinized just as it's colonized and whitified, as it were, just as it becomes heteronormative, because that's the terms. But we all know from queering the cinema that this attempt to structure it around the anxiety caused by the formation of masculine heterosexuality does not exhaust all the kinds of things that go with gazing, because prior to castration, we love looking, right? The baby just, the focal length of a child grows much longer. It has more power in its eyes than it does in its hands or its neck or its body. The eroticization of looking is one of the primary things, but not because it's erotic with things, oh, yum, 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 I'm going to have sex. It's just what it means, it's investing it with incredible pleasure. The other side of it is exhibitionism. Babies just make sure you look at them, right? They love being looked at. So
what do you mean prior to castration? Doesn't this just go on?
Yes, but in the way that we've plotted it out, we have the components of our visual field include eroticization of the gaze and pleasure in being looked at. What Laura Mulvey and co. in the feminist film theory says is when the Oedipal thing comes in, that's what produces the particular voyeuristic, sadistic, or fetishistic gaze. But it doesn't exhaust the realm of gazing. Right?
But I want the fetishistic and sadistic gaze to be available to everybody, you know.
Fine, you please have it, right? I mean, I don't mind.
Thank you very much.
Okay? But I don't think that helps us, because you may wish. What I think you're saying is there are ways we could talk about the eroticization of looking, and I think we go back to the Bert Morisot. I quite agree with you. Now, Morisot gets permission to explore the effect of, the sort of milkiness of young women's skin, the whole, the nape of the neck, the way in which the hair rises from this. I mean, everybody, all of these little collars, etc. She does it, but she gets permission in one sense because there's interest in Boucher, interested in Rococo. So after all this kind of very tight neoclassical, masculine and materialist and Courbet and all this kind of painting, and even the hard-edged quality of the pastel and the paint of Degas, which is full of, literally I can feel the sort of sense of what goes on as Degas tries to play out his anguish of relationships at certain kind of, underage female bodies. Her look, now, we could call it erotic, we could call it autoerotic, and there's no doubt that there is a homoerotic dimension, which of course nobody would dare to explain in the 19th century. But there's a wonderful art historian called Heather Dawkins, and I wonder if we could go to, I'm going to take you through to the number 9, the painting number 9. When, there's both the style of painting and the possibility of representing women's bodies together. So this is the copy that she extracted, and she put this over the entrance to her salon.
Of Boucher.
So, right? And then if you go to the other one we've got, which is number 11, you see she's copied her painting from, so Marisol is extracted from a Boucher painting, these two women in an incredible embrace. One quite clearly, her arm across another woman's breasts, pressing on them. The woman who's lying down, lying between the legs of the other nymph. Now, I mean, it's there in the painting. So I don't think we have to be afraid to say that these things, I don't think you see the same at all in Cassatt. I think she's fascinated with bodies. And she can work with bodies. I think she only does one semi-nude body, whereas Morisot does have a woman come into her studio, and she's fascinated. But why wouldn't she be fascinated? Because either she's wanting to explore as an artist her own body as a sexual body, or Heather Dawkins, when she writes about this picture, says, you could think about it in terms of mother-daughter, because her daughter's just coming of age, and the sense of a way of imagining the kind of intimacy that women had. And there's a lot that's been done about the language in the 19th century in which women wrote about each other. And this sounds a bit extreme, all these women who are writing to each other are declaring their love for each other, a sexual love, or there's a certain sexualization of the intimacies between women that was permissible because the gap between them and the world of men, straight men and their sexuality, was quite dramatic. So in some of the studies of the 19th century in America by a woman whose name has gone out of my head for a moment to come back, she says it's really fascinating. Women talk, I long to lie with you. I can't wait to hold you in my arms. Because in fact, rather like, I think, we were talking, Monika, about the portrait of a woman on fire, which obviously you're referencing in this exhibition. And in that story, in the context, women had to go and sleep with men and bear their children, irrespective of their own sexual desires. But sexual intimacy with women is almost fostered by the fact that this isn't a kind of a consensual sexual relationship that these middle-class women had as they were moved around and sold and married off in these sorts of ways. So I don't think this is voyeuristic and sadistic. I think this is telling us that painting and painters who are women are fascinated with female bodies.
I didn't know about these paintings. It's really exciting.
Other women's bodies.
And these paintings, Berthe Morisot kept in her private in her house, in her rooms, yes? Publicly on show. Ah, okay.
The Boucher painting the number 9, which is a copy from number 10, if you go through that for the public. So she goes to the Louvre repeatedly. So this is on show in the Louvre, and the de Goncourt are fostering an interest in 18th century painting at this time. And she goes to the Louvre repeatedly, and then if you go back one, I think, yes, she selects this to paint, and this is over the entrance in the sort of space above with a mirror, but in her salon, the main room. They go in and out of the room all the time, it's there. And the other one she paints after her husband dies and when her daughter is just coming of age. So I think you're right to say these paintings can be infused with things, and that we should acknowledge that the homoerotic gaze is part and parcel of women's painting, as well as just as the investigative gaze. It's a different gaze upon the woman's body. Okay. And Freud said women can't be fetishists. We don't fetishize. We're not afraid of the sight of a woman's body.
Okay, we leave that to the psychoanalysts, I would say. But maybe a last question before we open to the audience. There is one more common, let's say, like I don't know how you say, Zurückhaltung. Like holding by restraint. Thank you. Restraint towards the question of representation. Because Monika, when you had the talk about your paintings and your work here in the show with Toni, you were mentioning all the women like depicted or cut out like either depicted in paintings or like from the Sciamma film here in the young woman, the portrait of a young woman in flames. So you said, like, why these women? And you said, okay, you can maybe repeat it. Why these women? But that there is not a question of representation. And if the question of representation would come in, the whole project in a way would be spoiled for you. And Griselda, you have a very it's in the foreword of vision and difference, and you also wrote about the question of like how to change. Well, the book on museums it's not about doing museums better by just adding women, and you have a restraint against this question of representation, just having more women on the wall in museums. And when I was listening to you both, it would be much more how to change, like maybe art history, or is not about changing institution or changing the question of representation, but the acknowledging maybe the question of desire of women. And then the question how this could be done and how this, and to recognize also how female sexuality inscribed itself in painting already since a very long time, and just to acknowledge this fact. So maybe you want to comment on that.
I factually can't. I can't. Maybe Griselda can.
But you can say something about like why did you choose? Like which women did you choose?
Okay, so I can say.
I mean, you don't need to like go fully into detail with everyone.
All I can say is that's one of the collages or assemblages is rather stupidly has the title Zufall, which I know is dumb, but nevertheless, the reason I did that because I was thinking about intention. So, as you described before, Griselda, in this case with these works, I stopped myself after I sort of realized that there were going to be, or I was in the process of putting photographs of women or photographs of paintings by women into them. When I started to understand that was the case, I mean, it's only 6 of them anyway, but nevertheless, I then slid into the thought of, who am I representing? Suddenly it becomes a question of representation. Which women, white, black, painted, not painted, and so on. What do I have to cover? And then I stopped myself. So I retraced my steps and stopped myself doing that because that's not something I'm interested in within my work, and B, it's going to mess up what I'm concentrating on, and what I'm concentrating on, I don't know what that is even, but it's a kind of cloudy circling of associations that are sort of calling towards each other in my, for my senses, in my fantasy, and it's the Rosamunde Trockel page from Art Form was on my wall, so I just took it, it was on my wall for months, with menopause and the painting called Reborn with Spot, which is a copy of a female nude by Toulouse-Lautrec, which I didn't know or I forgot. And the model for this Toulouse-Lautrec painting is Susanne Valadon, before she even called herself Susanne. I didn't know that or I forgot about it. It does not register. So, and then the cover of a book I was reading, because it was lying around, my landlady in Los Angeles, was called Women Artists, and I was looking at that book from a certain time, and on the cover was this apparently self-portrait by Susanne Valadon, La Chambre Bleue, and that's there. And then I had seen the film, and I was really interested and also fascinated by Adèle Haenel about her role in that film and about the whole, discussion around the gaze in that film itself, and in the interviews that, the conversations between Céline Sciamma and the two actresses, and they were referring Annie Ernaux, and so on and so on. And that's how this thing sort of grew, and that was it then. That was all, and I just left it, So that's what I can say about that.
That's already a lot. So thanks. Griselda?
You see, that's what I mean about painting, okay? It ends up being, it's not the cause, but it arrives because of all those serendipities. And then we, the viewers, say, oh, I wonder why she did this. But in fact, what we need to have is exactly that strange coincidence of various things. I think we should stop being so possessive when we see images. Okay, so that's one point. I'm confused about this thing about representation. So the politics of representation for me is about what happens when images are made, what images are made, what images get authorized, what images don't happen. Okay, that's fine. Then there's the idea of, is the museum representative of the population of artists? So I absolutely agree that I'm doing in Modernity in the Spaces of Femininity is not to say, oh, please have Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot there because you need to be representative. It's to understand the question of modernity and the city and space and sexuality in being worked out in different ways by artists who constitute, each one a project, just like Monika probably saying, I don't know what to paint today. Oh gosh, that teapot looks interesting, sort of, and then something interesting happens. So
definitely not.
Nothing would happen with the teapot. Okay, this is I'm fine on that one. But what's the name? Giorgio Morandi spent an entire life saying, I'm not going to think about Mussolini by painting glass jars, and those are very beautiful. So anyway, I think I'm getting off the point here. What I am most interested in is the puzzle that paintings produce, however they come to be, for me when I am engaging with them. And so in one of my books called Differencing the Canon, I subtitled it Feminist Desire and the Writing of Art's Histories. And I talked about the sense that I'm not just trying to even up the score or make an argument. I desire to know something different. I desire to see something different from the way we are schooled to look at art, and even some of the ways that the early feminists' arguments put it forward, right? I desire something from paintings as a way to learn how else to be, how else to think, So when I look at the works of Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot or Suzanne Valadon, I don't think it's a self-portrait, the blue portrait. She has a very interesting relationship with models. She sets up a space between herself, who was a model, became a painter, and a woman who now models for her. And that's part of the dynamic that makes that an interesting space to think about what kind of desire and gazing is going on there. But I wanted to put forward this idea that I do this because there's more than just an intellectual or political obligation to get it right. I don't know what I'll learn. So could we just talk about the Artemisia Gentileschi for one moment? Because you, Monika, have looked at these two paintings and written about them.
Yeah.
All I would want to say before you say what you were interested in that, which is, in the case of Gentileschi, some of her works have been attributed to Orazio Gentileschi, her father, or other artists. And the oeuvre of Gentileschi is growing as the money is now coming, or the financial value is increasing. So I don't know if all of the things that are now attributed to her are her. But what I asked myself in the book is, how could I tell? If I'm not going to come and say, oh, she's a woman because she paints. So in one of the paintings, she paints a beautiful nude Cleopatra. And this has been attributed to her father and to her. What would be a sign of differencing? Not of her difference from a man, but of something that differences. I actively make something else happen. in a painting of a subject that lots of other people are painting, including lots of men, and very erotically, the death of Cleopatra, right? And in that painting, Cleopatra isn't quite dead. Mary Garrard notes her eyes are just a little open. And that means she's still there. So when you look at this picture, she's not just, oh, a beautiful body who fortunately has died so I can gaze on her as much. It interrupts that. When you notice that little detail, you have to say, she's dying. I'm witnessing somebody dying, right? And so when I argue, how could I tell the difference? That would be for me a possibility of saying, is that where Gentileschi is just taking the paradigm and just shifting it so you can't do certain things, and yet you're still seeing a beautiful nude, a nude woman. So my feeling is Gentileschi, I need to understand not the story about her, but what is this painter doing with paintings, with subjects that she knows these commissioners, these patrons want. They want, sex, violence, and videotapes, okay? That's what the Baroque is about. And I have to be there. I have to feel as if I'm literally in the room. I have to use Caravaggio to give me the whole drama. But she's not Caravaggio. She's not Orazio. She's done something. And I think you have a very interesting theory about where that shifting is happening. And I would love you to talk about your reading of these two paintings because of that.
Well, okay. Briefly, because there's also something else I really want to ask you too. Let's have a look. So this is the first painting, which is in Naples. I don't have the whole. I don't know. I'm not prepared for this. I don't know what year it is. Maybe you can help me. Oh, wait a minute. Here it is. 1611, 1612. It's in the Capo di Monte in Naples. So this is the first. I think there's two surviving versions of this painting. There must have been more. Whatever. This is the first, the earlier one. So untypically, they are actually really doing hard work. In Caravaggio's painting, I remember Judith has a very limp wrist. It's as though that knife sort of goes zzz through the neck. And here they're working hard. I mean, he's really, really drunk, and they're slaughtering him. And they're both, and also special for this painting is that it's two women working together. But in this first image, the blood is just seeping into that, theater stage edge mattress. Whereas in the second version, 10 years later, here we go. But now she's added to the painting a whole second layer of blood choreography. So here, in case you see that, there's this blood feather-like spraying out of his neck. What I find so astounding is when I saw the painting in Chicago, and I had a lot of time because, in the evenings I could go by when I was installing my show, nobody would be there. I noticed that there's actually paint blood splattered on Judith's décolleté. You can see it a little bit. I mean, when you see the painting in reality, it's speckled with blood. And here you see one big blood splotch, but it's full of it, And on the dress, I now see, and on the dress of the other woman and on their arms. And that paint isn't painted with a paintbrush, it's thrown onto the painting. But it's thrown onto certain parts of the painting. So the women are sprayed with blood, but he who is being slaughtered isn't, because he's just, he's just bleeding, but he isn't covered in it. So, it's clear that she can't just throw paint at a painting and not have it all run down the surface of the painting. So she must have laid it down horizontally and then sprayed on the, probably with a paintbrush, thrown on the paint as blood. And so that I find a really interesting observation, to have this second layer of activity after 10 years, to add this strange temporality even of cause, hacking away at the neck, then the violent bleeding of the neck, and then the effect of the bleeding of the neck. She's got this whole sequence of occurrences painted in the painting. And what I find really special, which I didn't mention in that little text, is that she shifts position from, we would identify her with Judith, right? We would identify Artemisia Gentileschi with that woman in the golden dress. We would say that's her. But to go through these actions within her painting activity, She slips out of the role of Judith and slips into the role of the man who's bleeding because she uses his blood to spray it on the décolleté, you know, on the dress. That's a complex thing to do, I find. That's what I have to say.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I love the, as it were, the sense of reading the way these things, and I mean, I'm a great follower of Monika Baer, who says, you know, the art historian says, how did this come to be? What made it possible? Historically, Baroque painting, Caravaggio, something. But then she says, but the painting happens in the present every time you see it. What makes it possible? So it's not that it's not grounded in history, etc., but when you read it, you see these details. And one of the lovely things that Monika Baer makes you see is she picks up on a Rembrandt painting. She noticed that the earrings aren't straight, so it means the woman is turning. You know, and that, you know, there's something happens when we read these paintings in these very particular ways. I'm not going to identify Gentileschi personally with any of these characters, because that's the danger of the story about the way that Gentileschi has been absorbed into culture. She's been made the narrative center of her own paintings.
That's right.
But it's all the time she is painting these magnificent women who do horrendous things as well as suffer horrendous things. So Lucretia, who's raped, but she has Esther, who risks dying to go to Ahasuerus. You've got this particular thing, and I think you picked up quite rightly the crucial thing about the two women working together. But I also draw people's attention to the radical change of space in this painting. In the first one, it's like the Cassatt thing. You're right there, and there's no space around them. The intensity of this tangle of limbs, the face of the Judith is in part shadow, this hand thrusting up to put away Chusia, the assistant, this extraordinary kind of dynamism of the composition. And then in the second one, if we go to number 13, the later one with the golden dress, are you seeing that one?
Yeah.
You can see what a completely, we've not got that tension anymore. She's angled the bed differently. All of the energy is in that much more the strong. So the two arms of the Judith figure are much more dominant. And I think you're right. Then this spurt of blood comes in to entangle Holofernes and Judith with this. But it's not. I'm not sure that she's shifted herself around, because the painter is all of them. You know, she's got to feel each one of those characters to create these kind of these kind of dynamic compositions. But this one has lost something of the urgency of the early work and becomes a more, we've got more space to see it as a tableau. And perhaps this sort of, this blood spurt then becomes a kind of a crucial thing in terms of, as you say, making that link. She's literally bearing the blood, but the direction of it is there. And I love the idea of thinking, how did she do that? How do you have to put the canvas on the floor or physically do that to get it? But I think these are really interesting, what it means to repeat a painting like this and give it such a different dynamic.
Okay, I think, Monika, you have a last question to Griselda before we open finally
We're going on for quite a bit already. I'm sorry, it's already 1.5 hours, by the way. Can I ask one more thing, one more observation, on the paintings that are in your book? Let me fiddle once more with this. Say, for instance, this painting, for instance, or the one that we looked at before, the 5 o'clock tea, right? So I'm wondering if so many of the paintings that are in the book depict women staring into space, not doing anything, not playing ball, not I mean, doesn't matter, whatever, but they're not actively engaged in the surroundings they're painted into. And for me, this has the quality, I read it as a quality of non-affirmation of their placing within that surrounding. So let's say in this painting, this woman is not affirming the gaze, and she's also not partaking in, actively in anything. She's sitting there as the woman in the 5 o'clock tea that hasn't got the cup in her face. She's sort of sitting around, and lots of women are sitting around doing nothing, sort of looking around, thinking maybe. So I wonder, well, what are they thinking of? And this non-participation of these persons, they sort of open up the painting, the disclosure that you've described, this enge, wie sagt man, the tightness, right? They create an opening to something else because they're not participating, You know what I mean? They're like vacant spaces in this very dense composition.
I wouldn't use the word vacant, but I exactly accept what you're saying.
Right.
One of the tragedies that we are not looking at the real paintings. They are the most spectacular paintings in terms of the energy with which they're painted, the way that the colors are produced, and all this combination of the composition. And you can see here this very, very compressed space. I think it's possible to say what she's endowing these women is interiority, because if you compare it to the kinds of paint, let's say John Singer Sargent or Carolus Durand, or the kinds of ways that, for instance, Degas' women always look stupid, right? If you see the Bolelli family, they're really kind of stately. Whereas if someone turns their gaze away from you and looks at something, and obviously if you're sitting being painted, you have to put up with something for a long time. I think there's a certain sense of allowing them to be contained within themselves, which is then they're not available. I'm just thinking of, we can compare this with other kinds of paintings where women are always offering themselves. Some gesture or the way that women look when they're being looked at, right? Whereas these women are not there, and they may well be very boring. This may be her sister-in-law that she didn't think much of. Some of them are pretty boring people, because that says so. They may not be, but instead that's the point. They are not there for this gaze. They are there to constitute the image that Cassatt is bringing forth, and they are within themselves. Now, that may be a vacant look, or in the case of some of the ones of her sister, where her sister is embroidering. I also engaged in a creative activity, or reading, which is why I have this picture here. These are ways of saying these women have lives within themselves, and they may be dressed up to the nines in, Worth couturiers because they've come to Paris to buy the clothes and they just have to go around and be these kind of fashionable clothes horses. But Cassatt says they are somebody there, whether an interesting or an uninteresting person, but they are contained within themselves and have an interiority.
Okay.
That's a positive. That's what I call a reparative feminist reading, as opposed to the paranoid feminist reading, which is they just have empty lives and they're only allowed to be.
Mine is much more enthusiastic and optimistic. For me, it's they're rejecting. They're passive from sheer. They are rejecting their participation in the setup they are socially placed in by staring into space and not smiling and not picking up something and not arranging flowers. I see even more positive,
Okay. So, are there any questions by you, or there's also the possibility of? Are there any questions from you, audience?
We've bored them to death.
Okay, this does not seem to be the case. Then, are there any other questions? No. Okay. So, then we are perfect.
Thank you very much. There are no questions, Griselda. We've covered everything.
Yeah, we've covered everything.
I do hope just people will go back and look at these works. I don't know if there are very many works by Cassata Morisot in Germany. When Cassira imported a lot of modern painting into Germany before it also got exported and came back again. I don't think the early 20th century was as aware as they should be of the role of women in 19th century painting, so there may not be many for you to see, but certainly it's worth seeking them out in the flesh. But I just want to say, from my side, this has been so fabulous to have this level of discussion with such a great and fabulous painter as Monika, and her interest and the questions, Susanne, that you've asked have been absolutely digging out some big questions, and maybe the audience just feels that there's a lot now to go back and look at Monika's paintings and look at these paintings, and hopefully we have done justice to both.
Yeah, I hope too.
Griselda, thank you for accepting the invitation in the first place and participating in this lovely way. It was really fantastic. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Susanne, too.
I loved it. Wonderful. Thank you.